Hi, I'm Kirsten Matthews. I'm a fellow at the Baker Institute in Science and Technology Policy. I also run the Little Center for Biomedical Ethics. I conduct research on ethical policy issues related to emerging technologies and biomedical research, as well as some stuff about the federal advice and funding for science. So I really feel like this morning's and this entire conference discussion kind of aligns a lot with what we do at the Baker Institute and complements perfectly. So I thank Louise for letting me be part of the process and part of the committee that put this together. Over the past several decades, it seems like technology has really changed significantly, and it's also changed how scientific research is being conducted and how it's actually going to the public. The International Conference on Recombinant DNA Molecules was held in 1975 in Asilomar, California, a beautiful resort there. I believe we're going to see some stuff about soon. It's more commonly known, though, to the rest of us as kind of the Asilomar Conference. Like, nothing else actually ever happened there except for this particular moment. And it's often referenced as an example that scientists used of engaging in the process of self-regulation, of working to find ways to do their research to make sure that it was acceptable to the public. But now that we're looking back after 50 years, or almost 50 years, sorry, 49 years, there still are questions remaining about whether this is really the right model we should use. Would it actually work now, 40, 50 years in the future? And can it or should it be actually updated? This first panel, which is titled Ever Since Asilomar, Past, Present, and Future Implications, is going to focus on this conference that happened in 1975. We have 4 distinguished panelists participating who will provide some context of what happened in the 1975 conference, how it was perceived, both today as a model, but also in the 1970s as well. And then discuss a little bit more about these questions about whether or not this is a good model or how it could be modified for current events. Each panelist will deliver short remarks, one at a time, from the podium, after which they'll just come up on the stage to the panel and we'll do a larger question and answer at the end of the session. So start thinking about your questions now as you hear Louise and the other speakers come up, and we'll all get to all of them at the end. I believe someone will come around with microphones to help with the Q&A at that point. So our first speaker, as you can see, is Dr. Campos. Dr. Campos is the Baker College Chair for the History of Science, Technology, and Innovation at Rice University. I also like to brag that he's a Rice Faculty Scholar at the Baker Institute, so we can claim credit too here at the Baker Institute for his work. Campos is a historian focused on contemporary biology research and its impact on society. He's actually only been on campus for a short time. Is it 2 years?
2 years.
2 years, but he's had a huge impact on the institution. I had no idea a year ago when I met him that he would do 6 events within like, what, a 2-year span? It dragged me into 3 of them, or organizing it. But I will say that his energy and enthusiasm has actually been unparalleled. He's so dedicated to his work and communicating it to the public, and it's really been an honor to collaborate with you. So this morning, Campos will talk about the Asilomar 1975 conference from a historical perspective, and his talk titled The Spirit of Asilomar. You can throw that up there. He's going to explore who participated, why it was organized, what the results were, how it's being viewed by scientists then and today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Campos.
So what is Asilomar, and why does it get invoked so much, especially in this conference, right? So first and foremost, Asilomar is, of course, a beautiful place on the Monterey Peninsula of California. It's a conference center on the grounds of an old religious retreat center, designed and built between 1913 and 1929. Second, Asilomar is an event. It's a 4-day meeting that took place in February of 1975 involving some of the more famous names in molecular biology at the time, at the very dawn of genetic engineering. It was a meeting intended to assess means of minimizing the risk of potential biohazards involved with novel recombinant DNA techniques before these had been fully developed and before much was really known about them. As one conference organizer noted, for the first time, there's now a direct method which allows us to cross very large evolutionary barriers and to move genes between organisms which have never had genetic contact. Or as another biologist at the time put it, what this technology does is to make available to us the complete gene pool of evolution. We can take the genes of one organism and recombine them with others in any manner that we wish. To my mind, he said, that's an accomplishment as significant as the splitting of the atom. In an effort to reduce any potential hazard from newly engineered organisms, the meeting also then proved to be an inflection moment for new biosafety procedures and for laboratory design. Among other things, it further developed the BSL physical containment system, and it tried to integrate physical and biological containment mechanisms by proposing the development of what they called a disarmed host strain. And finally, third, Asilomar is a spirit, as in the spirit of Asilomar that has haunted the world of science policy. For 49 years now, Asilomar has been a prominent touchstone for many contemporary discussions about what it means to conduct ethical and socially responsible research in biological engineering and in other fields. And the upcoming 50th anniversary of this meeting was indeed an incentive for our conference here today. Asilomar has long been framed as an unprecedented event in the history of science. It's been praised and denounced, remembered, and we might say dismembered regularly at every possible anniversary, beginning with the 5th anniversary, intensifying at the 10th anniversary, again at the 20th anniversary, and then definitely again at the 25th anniversary in 2000, when Science magazine even memorably reported that the Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA was the Woodstock of molecular biology. And the author went on to ask, but was it something that could or even should be repeated? And once you know what Asilomar is, you can't help but see it everywhere in the literature as a proposed process surrounding even the most contemporary of developments like synthetic biology in 2004 or CRISPR germline genomic engineering in 2015, the subject of the film that we'll be showing in the cinema later tonight. And the constant query, are we at a new Asilomar moment, alternates alongside references to the legacy of Asilomar or to the spirit of Asilomar. And even other fields totally unrelated to genetic engineering have been Asilomarized, with calls for an Asilomar for nanotech, for solar climate engineering research, for AI, and, wait for it, most recently, even cultivated meat and seafood. Have we reached peak Asilomar? Now, as a historian of science, I don't usually get to offer charts in my presentations, but in deference to our interdisciplinary context, I thought I would offer this Google Ngram showing the frequency of Asilomar as it appears in the corpus of English language published work scanned by Google up until 2019. You can ignore the early bump when Asilomar was established as a spiritual retreat center, which is, of course, on its face a rather different meaning for the spirit of Asilomar. But I see 3 moments of interest: a significant increase in the early 1970s, peaking in the years just after the 1975 meeting. Let's call that the Asilomount. And then a continuing reference to Asilomar in the years since. Let's call that the spirit of Asilomar. So let's dive in a little bit deeper into the history behind this chart. Beginning on February 24th, 1975, the famous 4-day International Congress on Recombinant DNA Molecules was held amid a collection of rustic cabins and meeting halls folded into redwoods and pines on the Pacific coast, as the brochure advertised. It was here, at this sea haven of enchantment for the conferee or the vacationer, that, quote, refuge by the sea, Asilomar, according to the 1973 promotional brochure, that 134 invited scientists, 82 Americans and 52 from other countries, as well as 4 legal experts, arrived to hash out the new potential perils of the novel recombinant DNA technology, all while being observed by 16 journalists. The meeting at Asilomar had been called to discuss lifting a voluntary moratorium that had recently been enacted concerning some certain kinds of potentially dangerous experiments. Concerns had been raised in a series of earlier meetings in 1973, and both scientists' and journalists' attention had been drawn to the matter when 2 scientists, Maxine Singer and Dieter Zoll, published a letter in Science calling for the creation of a committee to investigate potential consequences of in vitro genetic manipulation. The letter had announced that, as you see here, new kinds of hybrid plasmids or viruses with biological activity of unpredictable nature may eventually be created. Certain such hybrid molecules may prove hazardous to laboratory workers and to the public. Although no such hazard has yet been established, prudence suggests that the potential hazard be seriously considered. This 1973 Singer-Soul letter was followed up by the so-called Berg letter from Paul Berg of 1974 that called for a moratorium on two classes of experiments, one class that involved creating antibiotic resistance, and the other that involved cancer-causing viruses, until larger discussions about potential hazard could take place. So even well before the Asilomar meeting itself, journalists were noting this emerging discussion, as well as its implications for a larger public. And the question of who decides, then, was also a central motivation behind the meeting. One of the conference organizers, David Baltimore, recalled, "I was certainly concerned from the start of this that we had a responsibility outside of science and scientists. That the issue," he said, "was not an issue that scientists could decide ultimately for themselves in splendid isolation from the rest of the world." And so a meeting was scheduled for February 1975 at Asilomar in splendid isolation from the rest of the world. It was not an easy experience, and memories of the meeting are varied. Baltimore felt that it took up an incredible amount of our time and our energy, and it was emotionally draining, he said. Others, like Maxine Singer, were instrumental in organizing the meeting and yet described the public relations aftermath as a, quote, nightmare. And she wasn't the only one. Other young scientists whose research projects were delayed because of the precautionary measures that were called for later privately described themselves as being victims of Asilomar. But at the time, many felt that this was urgent, necessary work that was both technical and ethical at the same time. In 1973, Robert Pollack had felt that the field was in what he said a pre-Hiroshima condition. And in 1974, Baltimore described his generation as having grown up with, quote, the question of the moral correctness of the atomic bomb, unquote. And references to the atomic scientists, the development of nuclear weapons, the bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki are everywhere in the archival record of Asilomar and clearly in the minds of the scientists who called the meeting, who were having their own Oppenheimer moment. And disarming the bug became a preferred shorthand then for discussing biocontainment. You can hear the nuclear legacy in there. So Asilomar is often remembered as a meeting that focused on technical safety standards, and Berg indeed opened the meeting by talking about the potential hazard from laboratory practices underway, and more remote hazards, he said, that one could easily imagine, possibilities that should not be undertaken lightly, he said. But a sense of moral responsibility also clearly pervaded the enterprise, and several commentators at the meeting asked about what to do in the face of uncertainty as a policy question, how to deal with, quote, safety or morality, and the, quote, legal and moral responsibility that scientists might hold. These were held to be issues which transcend the scientific questions, unquote. So taking the time to think deeply about potential downstream consequences of research before engaging in it, those questions of research, risk, and responsibility was one of the motivations for Asilomar. These transcendent questions mixed freely with more technical assessments of relative risk from different kinds of experiments. Which experiments can be permitted in what kinds of facilities? Your work might be risky, but not mine, it said. Who will regulate? Can we self-regulate? And we can see from photos like these of chalkboards at Asilomar that they raised questions of a type that are still debated today, such as with CRISPR and gene drives. You can see here, what about industrial application? What about construction of MO, maybe modified organisms, parentheses viable, parentheses for intentional release? Only a couple of voices at the meeting warned that regulating risks that could not be quantified in advance risked bringing police into the lab, scholars have noted. And one of these voices was Jim Watson, who had co-discovered the structure of DNA 22 years earlier, who, quote, found the Asilomar experience an exercise in the theater of the absurd. And he later said, I just found the whole Asilomar thing irrational. I think we went public too soon, he said. We should have arranged a crash series of smaller meetings over a matter of 3 months and hammered it all out first. I think we all looked forward initially, or at least a few of us did, to getting to California the following year. It seemed a very nice place. How could you go wrong in a very nice place? But it is Michael Rogers' brilliant account of the Asilomar conference in Rolling Stone magazine, of all places, which arguably remains today the best account of what happened over those 4 days, and it is also a delight to read. For example, debating the ethics of human interference with the mechanics of evolution in a church at the edge of the immense saline test tube where it all started, rarely does one find one's metaphors so cheap or so apt. We know from Michael's account, and we will hear directly from him later in the hour, that the decisions taken at Asilomar were made in a manner that only at a stretch could be called fully rational and deliberative. And as a young Michael saw the scene, scientists were, quote, discovering parliamentary procedure, over beer, sitting in a chapel, next to the ocean, huddled around a forbidden tree, trying to create some new commandments, and there's no goddamn Moses in sight. Watson and John Tooze, the director of the European Molecular Biology Organization, would later even refer to Michael's account in the highest terms in their published collection of primary sources, The DNA Story, saying it would be extremely difficult to improve upon Michael Rogers' masterly description of the atmosphere at the Asilomar Conference in February 1975, and we shall not try. And so rather than try, I have reprinted a copy of Michael's extraordinary article for you all to be able to review for yourselves. And we've also posted a digital version on the conference webpage. A presentation by the invited legal experts seems to have made a significant difference, Michael says, in the tone of the meeting. And one of the experts proclaimed that Asilomar was an act of social responsibility and therefore can be considered a public policy decision. The legal experts also highlighted issues of workplace safety and community injury that had perhaps not yet been fully appreciated. As Berg recalled, while up to that point in the meeting there's a big split over whether we should say anything or do anything, these lawyers put the fear of God into everybody in that audience. They said, you guys are vulnerable and liable. If someone in your lab comes down with anything, you're going to go to jail. You're going to be shut down. You can be sued for everything. So Baltimore had opened the meeting by saying, many are looking to this meeting for guidance, and if we don't provide it, we'll have left a serious void. The goal for the meeting was the construction of guidelines, and quote, if we come out split and unhappy, we will have failed in the mission in front of us, and we will have no one to appeal to. We have to reassure the public, another conference organizer said, it's part of our job. And so coming up with a summary statement was one way of avoiding the prospect of imminent regulation. And as some of the participants said, if our recommendations look self-serving, we will run the risks of having standards imposed. We can't say that 150 scientists spent 4 days at Asilomar and all of them said there was a hazard and they still couldn't agree and come up with a single suggestion. That's telling the government to do it for us. So Paul Berg was growing increasingly concerned as the meeting went on without a clear path forward. It's just a waste of time to hack away at specific details, he said. Do we leave here after 4 days with a consensus or with only the admonition to be careful? As Janet Weinberg of Science News noted in 1975, could 140 gene scientists make a sociopolitical decision? After 3 days of proving they couldn't, they did. And she pointed out something else. The central obstacle, she said, seemed to stem from deductive training, from the ways that scientists learn to think and analyze problems. They were taught that there's a set of facts for every situation from which one can deduce other pieces of information. And in the absence of the facts, one cannot make an informed decision. Yet here they were being asked to balance the risks to society before they could possibly be quantified with the benefits to society, which they hoped would be large. And the conference deadline was pressing. Scientific minds, she wrote, were probably the worst kind for making sociopolitical decisions. And Weinberg's editor added an introductory note, only a short time before it was due to end, the conference still tottered precariously between consensus on proposed guidelines or dissolution into disunity. It could have gone either way. And yet, as the story goes, on the last night, the organizers stayed up until 4 a.m, putting together a statement that tried to summarize what they considered to be a consensus. But immediately after the Asilomar meeting, these ethical questions surrounding the deployment of recombinant DNA were hotly debated by, among others, the activist group Science for the People, a group of informed scientists, activist scientists, based in Boston who saw the decisions made at Asilomar as advancing the interests of elite researchers rather than a larger public. Decisions at the crossroads of biological research must not be made without public participation, they wrote in an open letter to the conference. The consequences are that experiments that happen to be conceived get done regardless of whether or not they should be done, they wrote. We do not believe that the molecular biology community, which is actively engaged in the development of these techniques, is capable of wisely regulating this development alone. This is like asking the tobacco industry to limit the manufacture of cigarettes, they said. So the ethical premise of Asilomar was contested from the very start, and the lines of who was scientist and who was public were already blurred. They concluded, we see even in the structure of this conference that a scientific elite is here alone trying to determine the direction that such regulation should take. And their raising Cain about the Asilomar meeting raised consciousness, and attentiveness to public concern even became incorporated into proposed designs for safer genetic engineering practices using bacteriophage lambda vectors named here Lambda for the people. So even as other prominent scientists who were not themselves activists by any means began to wonder, these distinguished graybeards and university chancellors, they began to publish about these sorts of potential risks of genetic engineering. And even as that was going on, this process of digesting and transforming the summary statement into NIH guidelines that would honor the spirit of Asilomar moved ahead slowly. And finally, at the last meeting of the NIH, then Berg said he was happy with the final draft, and he considered that the new guidelines satisfy all the objections he voiced to the earlier drafts, and that they are a faithful translation of the spirit of Asilomar. Others were perplexed at such talk. The chairman of the NIH's Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee would later write that, despite the many, many meetings which I had attended in Atlantic City, I had never heard a reference to the spirit of Atlantic City. He therefore felt that the experience at Asilomar was essentially a spiritual one rather than an intellectual one. It was, in the usual sense, not a scientific meeting at all. Whatever its purpose may have been in the minds of its initiators, a result was to fire the imagination first of the newspaper correspondents, he continued, and then, he said, of a substantial segment of the newspaper reading public. Now, even as the specific recommendations of Asilomar came to be institutionalized, they were also quickly marginalized. By 1982, one estimate held that the guidelines no longer regulated 95% of recombinant DNA research done in the United States, at least in part due to the industrialization of biotech, which was not governed in the same way by these NIH guidelines. And Asilomar's larger lessons also came to be increasingly contested through this time. John Maddox, the editor of Nature, wrote in 1993 that Asilomar was a, quote, wise decision that nevertheless left an awkward legacy. He wrote, Asilomar has become a lightning rod for generalized anxiety about genetics in any form. So participants at Asilomar not only foresaw the shape of future concerns, they even predicted that Asilomar itself would be invoked as a precedent in these later debates, and they did so in some instances even before the meeting itself took place. And so here we are all now, half a century later. As Asilomar co-organizer Maxine Singer noted at the 25th anniversary, only 25 years after Asilomar, she said, too many young scientists are unaware of or ignore the lessons of the public debate that racked our community. Many of them are so burdened with advancing their careers that they have little time for public involvement or for long-range thinking. And yet, she said, the post-1975 generation of students now number among the leaders in biological research. The 1975 Asilomar conference, she said, is an ancient story for them if they know it at all. So Asilomar was already ancient history 25 years ago. In time, Asilomar became a reference point for even the emerging field of synthetic biology. Science and Nature both asked repeatedly in 2004, is it now time for another Asilomar? And a new generation was being made aware of the legacy and the spirit of Asilomar, and some prominent synthetic biologists even assigned their students Michael Rogers' Pandora's Box Congress for discussion. And as early as the first International Congress of Synthetic Biology in 2004, synthetic biology demonstrated a conscious return to this Asilomar moment and engagement with its legacy. At the 1.0 meeting, one participant even said, in a clear echo of Asilomar's specter of governance, that, quote, we must set the framework for national policy or someone will do it for us, unquote. And so this frustration of trying to regulate the unknown was palpable, and the perils of not taking action were also mentioned. A few years later, at the Synthetic Biology 3.0 meeting in Zurich in June of 2007, there was even a guerrilla poster that appeared at the poster session, created by an activist civil society group and designed around a devastatingly creative and graphically compelling theme evoking the Little Shop of Horrors and accusing synthetic biologists of running a little closed shop of governance. So this was a narrative of Asilomar redux, but less about Asilomar as ethical guidepost than the opposite, Asilomar as elitism, raising that perennial question of who benefits, raised by Science for the People in 1975, alongside that question of who decides. So what has changed in 50 years? I find it remarkable that this meeting is still invoked in competing ways nearly half a century later. It's resurrected in countless new contexts. Atlantic Magazine even recently referred to a conference on Cas9 as the, quote, spiritual successor to Asilomar. And there are many invocations of Asilomar at the summits on human genome editing that we'll hear more about this afternoon and this evening, but also new references, as in the Asilomar principles of AI that were developed a few years ago, but that we heard a lot about last spring when ChatGPT hit the headlines. Even climate hackers and would-be geoengineers are returning to Asilomar to hash out whether the fate of the planet is up for engineering. So you've probably never heard of Asilomar before today. But it's central to all three themes of our conference, to futures of biological engineering, futures of data and surveillance, futures of climate change and governance. And as a historian, I am fascinated by the echoes and the legacies of this conversation and this dynamic over time, how the technologies may change, the politics may evolve, but the narrative frames and the contestations remain remarkably familiar. Asilomar has morphed from being a place, an event, and a spirit to a ghostly invocation that haunts every science society question of social responsibility, and like a ghost, it's often insubstantial in form but powerful in effect. So where do we stand in this great dispersion of Asilomars? Marx once held that history repeats itself the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce. But perhaps the novelist Julian Barnes's amendment to this famous maxim catches an important feature. That's too grand, too considered a process, he says. History just burps, and we taste again that raw onion sandwich which it swallowed centuries ago. Nature concluded in 2015 that we are now in a moment after Asilomar, where scientist-led conferences are no longer the best way to resolve controversial debates on scientific research, unquote. And so that brings us to today. The topics are scientific topics, but they are not only scientific topics. And we've begun with a poet and a futurist and now a historian in order to highlight these many other modes of approaching, understanding, and analyzing research, risk, and responsibility at the frontiers of science and engineering, to diversify our conceptual toolkit that will prepare us to grasp even better what's at stake with the truly fascinating science and technology that we'll be exploring in the sessions to come. So while we should know, understand, and consider the case of Asilomar, let's drop the Asilo myth. Rather than think of Asilomar as a model or a process, and that if only we understood what went wrong before, we'd know how to structure a conversation right this time and solve things in the future as if history is full of history bricks that work that way, I'd like to suggest from this deep dive into the history of Asilomar that we remember its very human nature. As Science News reported nearly 50 years ago, science, whether in the laboratory or the conference hall, is an intensely human enterprise, a product of the mingling of personalities, emotions, and consciences, as well as intellect. And this means that every question about research, risk, and responsibility that we grapple with today and in the future should be seen as an expression of a complex cultural dynamic that will always be operative, whenever and wherever we explore this interface between science and society. And that's why we began our many explorations today with the most important meeting that you've never heard of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campos. So we're going to transition to our next speaker. We've already talked a little bit about this particular speaker because he's been on the panel before, but I also want to introduce him again. Michael Rogers, I really feel, provided one of the more thoughtful and insightful reviews of Asilomar, and I hope you guys take the time to read the copy that you were provided with your agenda when you have a chance. So this is one of the few individuals we have here, I think the only one who attended actually the Asilomar conference in 1975. He is not a scientist, but a journalist to record and describe his perspective of the event and proceedings. He didn't describe it as a scientist or for a science journal, but Rolling Stone magazine, which offered that really unique perspective, I think. In addition to this work that we all have, he's actually quite fantastic with a best-selling author, a technology pioneer and futurist. He's won numerous awards for journalism. He's developed magazines through his career. He's helped existing media create new multimedia for the future. And obviously he authored that fantastic book. He gave us a little introduction to Emails from the Future, Notes from 2084. So please welcome me, or join me in welcoming Dr. Rogers this morning to do his presentation, The Human Drama of Asilomar.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, and Luis, thank you for such a good setup there. In fact, that covers so much. Well, I'll probably think of something to say, but I think one thing that I want to start with is to set sort of what I think the public sense of science was in the late 60s and early 70s, because I think Asilomar marked a real shift in public consciousness and emotion towards science. So I'll actually take us back to the early 50s and the polio epidemic, which in the wake of COVID, it's really interesting to read how similar a lot of the human reactions were to the mysterious polio breakout, as in COVID. For example, whole towns got shut down. There were rumors about where did this possibly come from. It was a tragedy because, it basically affected children. Post-World War II, everyone was having babies. That was the baby boom. Enormous emotional impact on communities. It's interesting to read the history. It's hard to express how terrifying this was for a country that had just come out of a war successfully and was in the middle of an economic boom, yet here is this ancient terror that they can't do anything about. And then, of course, came the polio vaccine. And this was on the order of a miracle. There was not a lot of vaccine resistance back then. In fact, this was really seen as just an amazing breakthrough. Everyone got the polio shot. It turned out to work very, very well. And by the early 60s, I believe polio was essentially extinct in the United States. So what I think happened then was a great admiration for the people in white coats. There is something to this science thing. They saved our children. And if you look, the 60s and the 70s were arguably the best 2 decades for science and technology in the history of the United States. We basically invented the internet. Those are the first 2 nodes of the internet up there. We invented the personal computer. Obviously, recombinant DNA, the underpinning of genetic engineering, and we put a person on the moon. That is not bad for 2 decades. And I think part of that came from the fact there was a lot of public support for science. That then combined, I think, with the counterculture. And starting in the 60s, there was a focus on how science and technology were supporting problems in the world, particularly in terms of warfare. But there was still an idealistic counterculture. So when computers came along, personal computers, it was really seen as another possible idealism made real. We even made up silly names for our computers. The computer on the top right was called the Kentucky Fried Computer. That was the company's name, which lasted about 6 months until the Colonel sued them. They changed their name to North Star and were actually a successful company for some decades. And of course, the Apple was simply Steve Jobs' favorite fruit. So there was this whimsical sense. And indeed, here's one of the more powerful organizations, the People's Computer Company, that basically was, the idea was to open free computer shops in communities everywhere so that you could walk in, computers belong to the people. This had to be, something that was widely distributed. Money was really not considered a big issue back then in the early days of the personal computer. And now, on the other side of the country, Science for the People was just starting up. And initially it was around actually the participation of scientists and technologists in the war effort. It began to expand, and you can see they took, at the same time as the People's Computer Company was setting up free computer shops, they took a little darker impression of it, which was, computer workers join with other workers, make computers serve the people. A very different tone. So we were starting, I think, to both still have this idealistic sense of what science and technology could do, but there was growing skepticism. So that's where Rolling Stone came in. In the early 70s, Rolling Stone began to try to branch out a little bit, wanted to do a little more general interest. We started to win journalism awards. I'd been writing and also studying physics at Stanford because I thought I was going to be an electrical engineer and support my writing. That way, I wanted to design computer chips. But pretty soon I discovered you could actually sell stories to magazines, and I thought, well, that's pretty good. So I ended up turning down a summer internship with a little chip company down in Santa Clara and went to work for Rolling Stone. So, of course, if I joined Intel back then, I'd be phoning this in from my yacht. But rock and roll was really good to me, the parts I can remember. And when I got there, I happily wrote about rock and roll and movies briefly, and then Jan Wenner, the owner, discovered that I knew a lot about physics and science, and he said, "You're going to be our science writer." And I said, "But I want to interview Stevie Nicks." And he said, "Anyone can interview Stevie Nicks, only you can write about recombinant DNA." So I was stuck. And so what I looked for writing in Rolling Stone was large stories with real social impact that involved a lot of people, because my audience was young, probably stoned. You really had to get their attention, and it had to be through people. So so basically I looked through science. Most of my ideas came from science. And that was me at work there. I went by that too fast. This was the early alpha wave detectors and generators, very early attempts at biofeedback, which of course was very interesting to me. And so my friend Annie Leibowitz took that picture, and I still get blissful like that. So, and I don't even have my alpha wave generator anymore. So I heard about Asilomar, and I thought, this is perfect, because big group of people, obviously, there's going to be good characters there, and it's extremely important. I wrote to get press credentials, and as I recall, there was sort of a delay. I wasn't quite sure what was happening. But fortunately, the previous year, I'd done an article for Rolling Stone on the longest total solar eclipse until 2150, an enormous scientific event that caused like 1,000 astronomers to flock to the middle of the Sahara Desert to do science in the totality shadow. So I'd done that story, because another good story for Rolling Stone, and I'd won a big science writing award for it. I was sitting at dinner where I got the award next to the head of the National Academy of Science, and I said, "Gee, can I go to this Asilomar thing?" And what could he say? You know, he'd just given me an award. So it was me and pretty much all conventional. Everyone else was a fairly conventional, normal science writer. So I really wanted to look for, and you'll see this in my article, I wanted to listen to people. I wanted to sort of sneak around and just see what people were saying. And the good thing about being from Rolling Stone and having long hair was particularly younger people, under 35, gravitated to you. What are you doing here? Have you met Mick Jagger? Important questions like that. Open it up, and then I could ask them questions. So it really was a way in many situations to get an insight that normally I wouldn't have been able to get. So, like for instance, just checking in. I sat there and listened to people checking in to Asilomar. And I remember one of my favorites was that most of the researchers knew each other, at least by reputation, and one was checking in and saw that his roommate, people had roommates, which gave it an even more collegiate kind of feel. His roommate was a researcher who specialized in primates. And the first researcher says, "I can't room with you. I'm an invertebrate man myself." Well, the other one says, "I'm an insomniac myself." And the first one says, "Great, at 3 a.m. in the morning, we'll rewrite the proposal together." So it was that kind of spirit that I wanted to pick up on. And once people were registered and they were outside milling around that first afternoon and morning, I went and listened, and it was just like being at a very obscure scientific conference. That was the conversation. It was just, what are you doing? What are you doing now? Where is that paper? Who's doing the review? Et cetera, et cetera. Just, actually not that much talk about what was actually going to be discussed, because everyone was just so excited to see each other. And it was, it set this tone of a scientific conference. Except the next day, it really started out in this, sort of dark, beautiful, but, somewhat somber chapel. I think it sort of settled in on everyone. And that's actually where I heard the quote that Luis used, which is, "Here we are huddled around a forbidden tree trying to create some new commandments, and there's no goddamn Moses in sight." Now that's the kind of quote that you can get when you're from Rolling Stone. If you were from Nature, you would not get that. So I was, the only one among the science reporters who did not have a really strong science reporting background. This was back in the days when there were great science reporters there. Many of them had been doing it for 20, 25, 30 years. It's a hard job explaining science to the general public, very dedicated. Most newspapers were rich enough back then to have a single dedicated science writer, so they were pretty knowledgeable. If there was any problem, it was what the newspaper industry they call the police beat problem. If you cover a single group long enough, you can begin to identify with them a little bit more than perhaps a reporter should. It's, just one of the hazards of the job, and you have to be aware of that. An example of how that worked back in the 70s is this was the first time I'd met quite a few of these people, and they were big names in science journalism. And the next year, I had another idea. There was a cell line going around called HeLa that actually had been integrally involved in the development of the polio vaccine, and was now actually causing some disruption in laboratories because it was such an unstoppable cell that was infiltrating other cell cultures. And I thought, this is really interesting, the history, and it came from a person, we don't know their name. I mean, this was a great story. And I decided to humanize it, I wanted to know who HeLa was. We knew she was a black mother who died in the early 50s, but that was it. And so I began to try to look around. All the researchers who were still alive and were involved said, no, we either don't remember her name, or we've sealed the records, or that's just not something we're going to discuss. So I went to some of the science writers because these guys were really wired in. They'd been doing it for 25 years. And I said, can you give me any help on this? I'm, really this is going to make the story so much better if I can find out who HeLa really was. I mean, she's a hero. And I remember one of the answers was, if the principal researchers don't want to disclose that, it is their choice. Okay. So anyway, I did a lot more digging, and I discovered that HeLa was Henrietta Lacks. And that story has gradually built up now, and there's actually a statue of Henrietta Lacks for her contributions to medicine. But that was sort of the science writing community that we had then. To me, the characters that were most important in keeping things moving were this triumvirate. And it was a mix of personalities that was very interesting to watch. Paul Berg, Maxine Singer, and David Baltimore, as was introduced earlier. Paul had this completely clean-cut California boyish, I've just come in from the tennis court, but very, lots of integrity, just a mensch, a really good guy, but somebody who, you would trust sort of innately. And so he did a lot of the talking, and he was quite good at that. Maxine was sort of behind the scenes, but extremely well respected. This is her at a slightly younger age than Asilomar, but she, had made her way in the male scientific world, very deftly, and done great science, and was much admired for that. And her political instincts were just killer. And so she was a little bit more in the background, but was really pulling things together, and was the one who organized the lawyer panel. In fact, her husband organized she asked her husband, a lawyer, to organize it. That was crucial. And then David Baltimore came from the East, so that was the more radical side. That was the, science for the people side. And he was bearded, and he had an embroidered Levi jacket, and he'd been in sit-ins. And so he represented sort of another force. And the three of them, in a way, sort of kept things. There were lots of other participations. People were really very active, but there was something about that combination Baltimore was really good at talking to people in between the sessions. And you can see here he's in his, more MIT, Cambridge kind of garb. Interesting thing about the Nobel laureates, we had two of them, Joshua Lederberg and, of course, Jim Watson, and you've heard James Watson's thoughts about all of this. I was fascinated by how little people paid attention to them. One researcher said to me, Nobel laureates can't believe in their own scientific fallibility. I've seen lots of them, and it's common to the phenotype. And it was interesting. Watson and Lederberg were both quite vocal, but didn't actually compose their thoughts that well, sort of spoke out of the sequence of the conversation, and even though in theory, these were the gray eminences of the place, didn't, in my view, have that much authority compared to the younger researchers. This is Sidney Brenner. You saw him introduced. He was a Brit, spoke in sort of an almost working class English accent, was really quite a character, and again, very well respected, and sort of the brains behind what you heard about the disarm the bug movement. But he had the ability to really stand up. He was never on stage, but stand up and clearly articulate things. I like this. He said, we have an opportunity to reject the attitude that will go along and pretend there's a biohazard and hope we can arrive at a compromise that won't affect my own small area, and I can get my tenure and grants and be appointed to the National Academy and all the other things that scientists seem to be interested in. So he sort of right out said the sort of unsayable, which is, hey, there's a lot of self-interest here and we've got to get past that. This is a group that really fascinated me. It was the Russians. They invited 4 Russians from Russia, and one very obvious KGB agent who came from the Soviet Council in San Francisco, spoke perfect English and really shepherded these guys around. The Soviets were so far behind in science that actually they spent a lot of time just photographing the slides. That was one guy used a flash to photograph the slides, and we just all thought that was so, wonder what, when he got back to Moscow and got the prints back from the drugstore, probably he was, but the interesting thing was there was a message from a telegram that was put under everyone's door by an activist, and it came from a man named Dr. Goldfarb in Russia who had been trying to emigrate to Israel and was not being allowed to emigrate because he worked in a biotechnology institute that had national security interests. Yet he was appealing to Asilomar to help them out. Well, immediately everyone saw that and thought, national security, my God, this is biowarfare going on there. So I was ultimately able to sort of stop the Russians for a while, and I asked the oldest Russian about it, the one who used the flash to take the pictures. Does research at his institute involve national security? And he huffed, he said, we knew Goldfarb was writing these letters. He started writing to heads of state, and now he is writing to the porters at the door. He just turned around, the KGB guy took him away. But another American was listening, and he just looked at me and said, Goldfarb's fucked. His next job will be cryobiology in Siberia. But it turned out, I learned later, that in fact he did get out and managed to get to the United States. So times were different then. Can you imagine, who we would invite now from antagonistic nations? So the other letter that came into the transom here was from Science for the People. Louise mentioned that briefly. This raised a lot of interesting questions, and it was absolutely, to the point about all the broad issues of genetic engineering. The good thing about Asilomar was that it had a scope, and I think that's one lesson. You've got to define a scope for what you're talking about, because it can be endlessly expansive. So one of the reasons that Asilomar finally sort of lurched to its conclusion was that people respected this letter and read it and understood what was being said, even if they didn't agree with it and it didn't particularly bode well for their work. But it was out of scope, so we can't think about it. As it turned out, we ended up thinking about it quite a bit because, particularly in Cambridge, there was, enormous public demonstrations, there were hearings. This is really where the Frankenstein monster of DNA started, that phrase. The mayor of Cambridge coined that. So finally, this to me was that East Coast, or that sort of more challenging approach to science really coming forward. I was actually at the time writing a book, and Paul Berg was helping me, and Berg was, I asked him, if you had known all this was going to happen, would you have done Asilomar? And he never really answered me, He said, that's hypothetical, out of scope. But it was clear he was very troubled. The other piece that I thought was really useful in Asilomar was there was a lot of people moving back and forth. There was not a strong hierarchy. So people would be brought in to discuss parts of the proposal. Other people would come in and out in a fairly informal way throughout the conference. And that was really quite healthy, and I think too much structure would have gotten in the way of that. This was actually an advantage. Now, of course, it was a very homogeneous group that knew how to work together, but it was a good example of progress. So finally, I'm going to conclude with the lawyer part. The lawyers were very, very important. I believe it was Maxine Singer's husband, and the timing. I asked Paul if it was intentional that the lawyers were on the end of the third day, and the fourth day, the decision had to be made by noon. And he said, not really. It was just, sort of, I think it's because the lawyers weren't scientists, so they got left to the last. But it turned out that was a great idea, because, as Louise said, the lawyers just scared the dickens out of the audience. And it began with Maxine's husband, who got up and said, he began with a joke. He said, a lawyer and a scientist are arguing about which is the older profession. Goes back all the way to Maimonides versus Hammurabi. And finally the scientist said, God must have been a scientist to create order out of chaos. And the lawyer says, where do you think the chaos came from? And that set the tone. So another lawyer announced in very dry terms that he would be talking about conventional aspects of the law and how they may sneak up on you in the form, say, of $1 million lawsuit. Another one said, your laboratory workers could quite easily invoke OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And the OSHA Act is overseen by the Secretary of Labor, who has nothing to do with science. Another one said, it is the right of the public to act through the legislature and to make erroneous decisions, which was a good reason for the scientists, I think, to get their act together. But by the end of the session, one lawyer was advising the researchers to get extended personal liability coverage. Literally, he said, then if you do get sued, at least you won't have quite so much to worry about. So that was very effective. And the last day came, and it was, just cacophony for a while. A couple of things just to indicate sort of how cacophony it was. My favorite was right in the middle of a serious discussion of something, of a point that was in the proposal. Someone stands up in the back, and I wish I knew who this was. It seems to me that there are invertebrates, like mosquitoes, that contain diseases that are dangerous to humans, and if we just go willy-nilly, joining mosquito DNA with E. coli, I'd hate to think I could get malaria from walking around on the street. And it sort of sinks in, and someone in the front row goes, huh? And somebody else kind of sotto voce says, how could you get malaria? And the front row says, can they explain? Say it louder. Can you explain how a protozoan parasite could result from an E. coli and thus cause malaria? Long silence as everyone realized this was not a reasonable scenario. And Berg finally said, we will take this comment under advisement. And then the same voice in the front row, it's bloody nonsense. So that sort of was the tone of it. And then finally, Sidney Brenner, who could really cut through to things. And his timing was perfect. He stood up and said, "Please," sounding really sleep-deprived, "could I ask whether, in paragraph 6, if the phrase, 'this document represents our best assessment of the biologic hazards,' we might change that word 'best' to 'first'." And somehow that just released all the tension in the room. And it finally got done. That went on the next day after Asilomar. The group, organizers moved up to San Francisco to meet with NIH people to start to put together the formal guidelines. And that was one of my, and I went up there and sat there and spent some time. And it was really boring. I mean, it was so different because, now it had to be codified. It's interesting, Louise mentioned DeWitt Stenton, who was involved in this, an older gentleman who questioned the spirit of Asilomar. He was a crusty guy. I remember at one point, he used a phrase I'd never heard before. He said, in the old days we used to say the solution to pollution is dilution. And he said, this is much better. Okay, so anyway, at the very end, I'm sitting there and almost falling asleep, and the Maxine Singer is looking at the documents all across the conference table, and she starts to laugh. People look puzzled. Do you realize what this means? And then there's silence. This means that we've just made human sex a moderate risk experiment. And there's silence, kind of tentative laughter. But somebody points out that's only in the laboratory. So anyway, Asilomar couldn't happen today. There are so many other aspects, that was really a crystallized moment. But it was a crystallized moment, that I think showed some of the ways forward. The notion that you need a scope, that you need a structure that allows a lot of interaction among smaller parts of the group. And ultimately, it needs to be connected to, decisions need to be connected to a legal or financial penalty, because that is the society that we live in today. That's how you set the rules. So I think there are lessons from Asilomar, and I look forward to hearing more thoughts about that today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great to hear the personal anecdotes from the entire experience. Our next presentation this morning is from Dr. Matthew Cobb. He is a professor of zoology in the Division of Evolution, Infection, and Genomics at the University of Manchester in England. So thanks for traveling all the way to our conference today. He has a background in both psychology and genetics, studying behavioral genetics. In addition to this work, he's actually authored several books. One called The Egg and Sperm Race, the 17th Century Scientist Who Unraveled the Secrets of Sex, Life, and Growth, which sounds fascinating. Another one called Life's Greatest Secret, The Race to Crack the Genetic Code, as well as a few books related to World War II and France. His talk this morning is titled One Meeting, Many Meanings. And he will discuss the Asilomar conference itself, what is kind of accomplished, and maybe a little bit about what it actually failed to do. So please join me in welcoming Matthew Cobb to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be back on this beautiful campus. So I'm going to be talking about some of the undercurrents, the things that happened at Asilomar that most people didn't notice, although at the risk of turning this into a kind of Michael Rogers fan meeting, he did, his journalistic antennae twitched at two very important moments that were extremely significant in what the meeting was actually going on there. And the two things that I'm going to talk about are money and murder. So I think the first thing to remember is that this is a US meeting, but it has global implications. And the molecular biologists are always very proud about this, about the claim that we self-regulated. We were able to come up with a set of criteria, which we've heard that the idea was to stop the government coming into the laboratory. Well, that may be the way you do things in the USA, but around the world, we tend to have a more official way of regulating science and technology. And in the UK, for example, very similar regulations were actually written into law and are still in force in terms of what experiments you can and can't do. And Asilomar actually was the cusp, the beginning of a huge change, which we can now see in particular here in Houston and on the Rice campus in terms of the US commercial and scientific domination becoming fused together with the development of startups and so on. But I'm not going to talk too much about that bigger picture. I want to look at the two issues that are underlying what was going on at Asilomar. First, the question of money. And this is a moment in US history in particular when there was a pressure on universities to start commercializing their discoveries. The Dole-Bay Act, as it was called, was there to actually ensure that universities tried to finance develop their research and apply it and actually make money out of their proposals, the work they'd discovered. And the key breakthrough for genetic engineering came with this paper, published by, in particular, Stanley Cohen and Herb Boyer, which was a way of making much more simple the technique that had been developed by Paul Berg a year earlier. And this was published, as you can see, in November 1973. And it's this development which actually led to the great excitement about molecular genetics, about genetic engineering, but also great fears, because this was, as it always is, so simple a high school student could do it. It's not quite as easy as that, but certainly a high school student can understand how to do this kind of experiment. So this paper was actually fundamentally significant in creating the concerns that we heard expressed in the Singer-Sol letter and then later on in the Berg letter, culminating in the Asilomar meeting. And Niels Riemer of the Office of Technology Licensing at Stanford, he's the guy who actually picked up on this, who actually noticed this article in the New York Times, where the journalist Victor McElhenney, who was at Asilomar, said, well, maybe we could do things like, for example, producing insulin using this new technique. And Riemer's thought, wait a minute, that's pretty interesting. That could be a huge market. And so he, together with Boyer and Cohen, actually, persuaded them to take out a patent on this new technique. And Michael actually noticed this. He'd done his research, and that's Michael there. That is you, isn't it? Yeah, that is you. With a very trendy 70. You've got a beard there. It looks like you have, maybe not. So this is in one of the press conferences during Asilomar. And so he writes in his excellent article that you could isolate the gene that codes for insulin production, and that could change everything. So he sensed that there was something going on here. It wasn't simply about scientific research, but there was the possibility of absolutely transformational investment and production. And indeed, 5 years after 1975, the Asilomar meeting, Genentech launched on the Wall Street, making Boyer and Cohen multimillionaires. So within 5 years, the situation had completely transformed. This wasn't simply a technique in the laboratory. This was now being used to create drugs that are, and this is still how insulin is produced today. Those of you who use insulin, it is all created in genetically engineered microbes. And that insight came from Genentech, which was incorporated the same week as Apple computers in Silicon Valley in California. So there's a huge synchronicity going on here. So there's something in the air And you can actually see this in this picture. So we've seen this picture already, and the person circled in red is Rich Roberts of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. And he was certainly about to make a huge discovery, that is that genes in multicellular organisms are split into lots of little pieces, which is one of the reasons why many of the fears as to what might happen in Asilomar that was dealt with in Asilomar actually turn out not to be a problem, because if you put a human gene into a bacterium, the bacterium doesn't know what to do with it because it doesn't have the right processing mechanisms. And eventually he won a Nobel Prize for that discovery. But the key thing about him is just initially I looked at this photo and I thought, well, he's obviously a kind of quite a square guy compared to the rest of them, because he's got a nice shirt on and tie, and he looks like a schoolboy, to be honest. He's English, and he looks like an English schoolboy. But the answer is almost certainly somewhat different, in that he had tried to convince Jim Watson at Cold Spring Harbor to set up a company to sell restriction enzymes, which were kind of the key tools of this period of genetic engineering. Because who makes money in a gold rush? It's not the miners, it's the people selling the shovels. And that's what he realized, there was a huge market here. And he'd recently become chief consultant for something called New England Biolabs and went on to make a great deal of money, and the company went on to make a great deal of money by selling these molecular shovels. So he's actually here already moving in a different world. He's not an academic, simply an academic, he is now moving in this commercial world. So there's, in fact, a hidden time bomb in Asilomar, which virtually nobody knew about. And Michael sniffed, but didn't actually know about the details either. Because Paul Berg discovers this patent had been taken out. He knew nothing about it. The meeting's already going ahead. A couple of weeks before it happens, there's a meeting in Berg's office with Reimers, Cohen, Hognes, Janowski, and Davis. All these other people are people who could potentially be in on the patent, but aren't. So they're not going to make a load of money, but Cohen, for example, is going to. And Berg was really, really furious because, I mean, this could completely blow the meeting apart if it got out that there was a patent for this technology that scientists in that room stood to make vast sums of money out of if the whole technique was approved. And apparently the meeting was very strained. Well, I bet it was. But by April, things had gone okay because nothing was said. No mention was made of the patent. They were able to keep the lid on it at Asilomar and stop what would have been I'm sure you'd have loved that story, Michael. It would have completely undermined the idea that this was some kind of, just completely disinterested discussion. And in fact, there was a lot of money to be made of. So we got the reason why it didn't get out is you've got a conjunction of Berg's political interests. He wanted to get the meeting to come to the decision. He was not involved in the patent at all. And the financial interests of Cohen and Boyer, who were both there, because without an agreement to lift the moratorium that had been imposed, the self-imposed moratorium, then that patent would have been worthless. So that's the financial time bomb. What about the murder time bomb? And we've got a hint of this. And again, Michael sniffed this out. Because they actually forbade any discussion of bioweapons. The opening session, David Baltimore said he thought the issue was very serious and which many of us have cared about for a long time. Again, that radical approach. The potential to utilize this technology for biological warfare. I think it's obvious this technology is possibly the most potent technology for biological warfare, but this meeting is not designed to deal with that question. So all discussion of the potential misapplication of this technique was ruled out of order. And one of the reasons for that is that in one of the probably two things that President Nixon did well, one was the EPA, the second was this completely out of the blue decision to abandon bioweapons research and destroy stocks, which he took in 1969. And by 1975, so about 2 weeks after Asilomar, something called the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention was ratified and signed up by most of the major countries. So it looked like this was a problem that didn't exist anymore, and that's probably one reason why Baltimore was quite keen not to discuss it. And as we've heard, Alexander Goldfarb, who was not actually, he was in a biotech lab, but he wasn't actually working on weapons in any way, shape, or form. He actually tries to persuade people to come to his aid. They don't, but eventually, later on that year, he was allowed to leave. So who were the Soviet delegation? I'm going to talk about three of them: Baev, Engelhardt, and Mirza-Bekov. And Mirza-Bekov was the young man, we'll see a picture of him in a minute. He was particularly well known to Western molecular biologists. He'd worked in Cambridge, England, with Francis Crick and Max Perutz on something called transfer RNA, so he was actually well known to them. And shortly after this meeting, he went on to Harvard to meet somebody called Wally Gilbert, who won the Nobel Prize, to give a conversation gave Gilbert an idea for how to sequence DNA. So Mirza-Bekov is friends with everybody. He knows all these people. Baev, one of the older gentlemen, he spent time in the Gulag as a Bukharinite terrorist, poor man, but he remained extremely loyal to the regime despite its terrible mistreatment of him. And Engelhardt had played a key role in rebuilding Soviet genetics after Lysenko had destroyed it, basically under Stalin's influence. And a key Moscow institute is now named after him. And again, Crick, Watson, many of these people, they had stayed with Engelhardt. They knew these people. It wasn't any surprise that they were chosen to be involved. They were indeed prestigious members of the Soviet Academy, but they were also friends. And they were all extremely significant figures. They all, for example, had obituaries in the New York Times when they died. So here we can see Baev and Engelhardt, and seen from the other side, Engelhardt and Baev. They look and we've already seen this. This is a quote from Michael's article. "The Russian presence is somewhat puzzling. The Soviets number 5, 2 oldsters in black suits and narrow ties, both with thick, healthy shocks of nearly white hair, along with 2 younger scientists." And I'm not going to do the accent. The Rolling Stones is a jazz band, no. And a charming, dapper San Francisco vice consul performing chaperone service. And this was a comment by one particular, we've heard about their behavior, taking pictures, flash pictures, and generally seeming a bit kind of old. "These Russians," an elderly microbiologist from Wisconsin says one night at dinner, "they just send over the old guys from the academy who don't know anything. You ask them then something and they hedge around, and it's not they're hiding things, they just don't know in the first place." Okay. Well, something was happening in the USSR at this time. It was called biopreparat. Also called the system, also called A1063, lots of code names for this program, which is really quite terrifying. In 1971, so this is before the first genetic engineering experiment was carried out, Soviet scientists alerted Brezhnev to the possibility that genetics could build new weapons. And this is despite the Soviet Union signing up to that international treaty I mentioned. And the deal was, you give us lots of money to build molecular biology, we will give you new bioweapons. And in April 1974, this biopreparat, this huge network of research labs was set up under the control of a military-dominated council called the MNTS. And eventually this employed 40,000 people. And it had 2 main wings: ferment, which was aimed at killing people, and ecology, which was aimed at destroying agriculture. We know quite a bit about the ferment program, very little about the ecology one. And this led to a massive expansion of Soviet molecular biology, but clearly at a terrible price. So the question is, what did those Soviets know? They knew everything. So these old guys who just don't get anything and are taking pictures with a flash, I think John le Carre, the thriller writer, would call that good cover. Here we got their members, Baev and Mirza-Bekov are both members of that MNTS, which is running the biopreparat system. Baev worked with Ovchinnikov, who was the guy who was actually behind it all, and co-signed the letter to Brezhnev. Mirza-Bekov was a member of MNTS, and Engelhardt was the head of the Institute for Molecular Biology, which was one of the main contractors for ferment research, that is, how to kill people. They knew what was happening, and they were involved, and yet nobody apart from Michael, seems to have thought, wait a minute, there's something fishy here. And even Michael didn't suspect quite how awful the actual situation was. And you actually asked them directly if recombinant DNA had military implications, and they dodged the question. Everybody just assumed they were old guys who knew nothing. The Soviet Union, their genetics has been trashed by Lysenko. What's the problem? So this is the problem. This is what happened next. So people soon realized in the mid-70s that there was a massive increase in Soviet spending on laboratories, and Baev said that such actions, if they occur, in fact contradict the Convention on Prohibiting the Development, Production and Stockpiling of Bacteriological Weapons. That's true. Such actions also contradict the moral code of science. That's true as well. And yet that's what he was doing. The bonfire program was actually able to change the antigenic profile of plague. And they were also made plague able to produce a toxin against myelin, which would, in fact, paralyze you. And this actually worked. They actually had a microbe that they had been able to engineer to do this. In 1979, there was an anthrax leak in Sverdlovsk, which killed 68 people. And when Joshua Lederberg went to try and find out what was going on, Baev, who knew him very well, said, oh, this is all this talk about it being anything to do with any biological warfare. This is just the talk of dissidents. You should ignore them. So they were completely playing the game because that was paying the money. That's the deal that they had made. In the 1980s, the mid-1980s, suddenly the West discovers this. It must be said that Western intelligence had no idea of what was happening. Two people called Pasechnik and Alibek, in particular Ken Alibek's written a terrifying book about this, defected, and they revealed the scale of the project to Western intelligence agencies. In 1991, obviously, the Soviet Union collapses, and there's an agreement with the West that these bioweapons labs are going to be dismantled. But by 1996, with many of the labs still active, that treaty lapsed, and then we know nothing. We can only imagine what has happened since then. So we can see that, yes, Asilomar focused on specialist experimental knowledge, mainly US participants, and effectively it was deciding for the world what we should be doing. But it refused to address potential military applications and the potential of money to distort scientific priorities. And both those things were happening under the nose of everybody at the meeting. Nobody knew both those things. Yeah? Obviously, only the Russians knew about what they were doing, and only a handful of people knew about the patent and the potential, therefore, for this whole thing looking like a kind of put-up job so that scientists could get rich. What would have happened had those issues been highlighted? Would anybody apart from Michael have dared to ask the Soviets, and what kind of answer would they have got? They probably got stonewalled anyway. With the international treaty in force, it looked like the problem had gone away, there wasn't an issue. And what if the organizers had grasped what the Soviets delegation were doing? These people who were their friends, who they'd worked with, what would they have done? And I think what's really interesting about this is concealed in meetings and events. There's the surface, what we remember, but often by reading carefully journalistic accounts or thinking about the people, or in the case of discovering what these Soviets were doing, simply looking in the index of a book about the history of the Soviet bioweapons program, you can discover quite astonishing things. The final thing I think is really interesting. So we know the KGB were there. I mean, they'd be crazy not to be. But what about the NSA? What about MI6? You've got these scientists with the potential for producing terrifying weapons going off to a meeting where there are Russians, there are all sorts of people, and you just let them go? I mean, maybe they did. I don't believe that for an instant. Joshua Lederberg was very close to the CIA. He debriefed many of the Russian defectors in the 80s and 90s. Maybe he told them what was discussed and so on. Or maybe there was someone in the room. Nobody knows. This is one of the mysteries. But if the Soviets had their spies there, then I think it's absolutely certain that the West must have done too. Okay, if you want to know more about this, then the Soviet biological weapons program by Lichtenberg and Zelinskas is a terrifying and very detailed account. And then I've written a book which is, this isn't my title, it's a very pretentious and pompous title. It's insisted by my US publishers. You know, it's okay. But it's all about the history of genetic engineering, including the Asilomar Congress and the subsequent realization of what was really going on there. Thank you.
And we have one more short presentation, and this is from Dr. Joseph Campaign. He is a Rice University professor. He's the William Shakespeare Professor of English, which seems like a really intimidating title. And he's also the director for the Center of Environmental Studies. So he's going to present on one of his projects called the Investing in the Futures.
What's the method? Oh, great, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Joseph Campana. I'm very cognizant of being the thing between you and lunch. So this will hopefully just be kind of a quick way into something I think is very important to the core issues that have come up already today. And first off, thanks and congratulations to Luis Campos and the steering committee for already creating an extraordinary occasion. We think a lot about not just who decides, but what does it mean to cultivate a critical imagination for the future? And that's something that's very important to, oh, here we are. Whoops. To an organization I direct, the Center for Environmental Studies, which includes with it the environmental studies curriculum. A lot of the work that we do is very much arts-based, and I'm myself both a practicing poet and a scholar of early modern Europe, which is to say either a scholar of Shakespeare's era, a scholar of the era of the Little Ice Age, which marked all aspects of human life in that time, and not just the geological record, and also a scholar of the era of what was often called the New Science and the kind of waning days of humanism, which, for whatever else it did, valued multidisciplinary conversation and collaboration. A lot of our projects are extremely arts-based, which not only means presenting the work of artists, and it's really wonderful to be part of a conference that values the contribution of artists in the way that this one does. It also means drawing on artists' sensibilities and practices. And a number of our projects have done that. Sometimes that means creating data visualization and environmental storytelling projects, as we did with Bayou City Waterkeeper. You can kind of see some of those hovering in the background there. It might also mean working with the Houston Climate Justice Museum, which uses visual arts, art historical, and curatorial practices to engage in important topics like what on earth is going on, or under the earth is going on with creosote in the 5th Ward in Houston and Kashmir Gardens. We are also kind of part of a new effort in the new Rice Sustainability Institute, Eco Studio, which is all about arts and media strategies and community conversation. And it could mean a number of these projects, as I said. It could also mean starting a radio show, which we did, Gulf Streams, which is which is part of the KPFT Pacifica station. What I want to talk today is about a sort of project directly about this cultivation of critical imagination for the future. What does that mean? How do we harness the imagination but also direct it? And we began a number of years ago to work with a couple of artists. They think of their projects under the rubric of this sort of more and more, as they say, a playful approach to changing a world that is stuffing itself with more and more things, more and more technologies, more and more pollution, more and more everything. What does it mean to try to cut through some of that? And as they often like to say, to cut the cord with the present, which is to say, how do you imagine differently? Sometimes solving problems means having at your disposal options that don't yet exist. And so they created a system for that. And I just want to sort of say quickly, these are those two artists that we work with, Marina Zurko and Sarah Rothberg. And what they created a number of years ago was a deck of cards. And in fact, I have the latest edition of it, and in fact, I think the speakers on the panels have already got or will get a version of this. It was a deck of cards with categories arranged in different important areas: shared values, communication, economics, medicine, etc. And the point of it, which was to imagine together in small groups a world you would like to live in. based on a number of constraints, circumstances that are outside of your control, some of which might seem utopic, some of which might seem dystopic, and some of which might seem just weird, because that is what life actually is like. So the critical things that are part of this, and that sort of impulse, a world you would like to live in. That's what the critical imagination for the future has to come up with. A world we'd like to live in, whatever circumstances we're running into. So they sort of have worked with this initially from a kind of little Kickstarter edition that produced maybe 100 or 150 boxes of cards that a number of us got. But the kind of game itself, quote unquote, again, you draw 6 cards, you work with a small group, you imagine the world that would result from the implications of these cards, then you inhabit that world through a series of role cards. What does it look like, first-person perspective in that world? And then you share the stories and reflect on it. It's a very powerful tool we've used with our colleagues, with our students, and increasingly with our kind of community environmental advocacy partners to sort of think differently. A number of years back, we actually created an online version of it. I don't have access here to a kind of live website, although I sort of flipped some cards with you. But this is sort of free. It's at investinginfutures.world. No, I'm sorry, it won't work on your phone. Your screen is just too small. But you can access this another time. And again, we've integrated this into a lot of our activity and certainly to our curriculum. I mean, it's by far one of the most popular things we do with our students because they feel very urgently that they need to think creatively and critically about what the future is going to look like for them especially. And you can already see some of the kind of cards range from the extremely practical to the extremely odd. And that's in a sense part of the point. I'm not going to move through all of these, but I just want to say a few things about what we've been doing with it, which is to say, we have kind of been creating some expansions. So we created this website for their system, in exchange for which they created a version of it around waste, which is available online, not in a kind of card deck system. We were having a series of conversations across disciplines and actually across centuries about various ideas of waste. The cards are provocative and sort of rather intense, but force us to consider some of the kind of core experiences we have. And we're moving into some other sort of versions as well. We're currently working on a version of the system to tackle energy and energy transition. And what are the multiple facets of that you would have to think about to have different eventualities arise around the kind of intense things that we experience now about energy transition? That's kind of ongoing. And it started with a small group of scholars advising, I said started with, we're in the middle of it right now, advising. They'll be sort of testing a version of it with a soft launch March 18 to 20 sometime. We're kind of scheduling a visit. And the point is to sort of integrate it into, again, classrooms where this has been actually rather effective, right, in university settings, but also in sort of secondary settings. The second one that we are sort of and this is some of the prompts that once you sort of build the world, you might be asked to sort of answer. The second one that we're building right now is called a kind of coastal futures. And one of the points of it is to see how well it works outside of classrooms, outside of university and teaching settings with a number of our community partners. And that's kind of upcoming in the next months. All I want to sort of say as a way of just sort of closing things down and sending everyone off to lunch, which is that we're trying to sort of work harder to integrate research into sort of many aspects of activity in our teaching, to not as always see the differences between teaching and research, because we're trying to create the next generations who will be answering questions like who decides, or is that even the right question to ask? And we're trying to sort of work more fluidly outside of the university with partners who have expertise we don't, and actually that we need to address some of the kind of conversations that we're having within the halls of the academy. And then the last thing I'll just say is that something powerful about cultivating a critical imagination for the future is that it involves conversation and it involves community. I'm really delighted to be part of the sort of temporary community that forms around the Lange. But what I want to sort of say in closing is one of the other projects that came out of this whole system, Marina Zurko and Sarah Rothbard installed in MoMA in their creativity lab a kind of one-card version. They also created a little card deck based on that called What If? And I just pulled one card and it said, "There are no words for I and my." Thanks very much.